Hiya and welcome to this week's episode of Inside Property Development, where I'm speaking with Lewis Herbert. Lewis is an ex-councillor, he's trained planning committees, he's massively knowledgeable housing and has been fairly influential himself in actually helping lots of really good quality housing get created in and around Cambridge in particular. So I'm really looking forward to talking to him this week. Thanks for coming, Lewis. Right, well, we've had lots of chats about housing before. What are we going to talk about this week?
First of all, I think it's right that we look at the data. Britain's not been building enough homes. We keep hearing promises from successive governments that we're going to get 300,000 homes a year. But I think what I particularly like to look at is the whole span of 80 years. I'm going to get involved in sort of the celebrations, the remembrance of the people who came back from the war. We had a period for 30 years, major house building.
Yeah.
And then since then, there's a couple of stories, but one of them is we just haven't been building enough. And there's all sorts of reasons, but I'd say we had really good leadership on housing for 30 years, and then it vanished.
So let's have a look. So do you want to? So we've some of your graphs here.
Yeah, just a few.
Now this is going to be tricky for people that are not on YouTube. So what I would suggest, if you're not watching on YouTube, go and watch on YouTube Inside Property Development. But for those of you that, for whatever reason, just
sitting back listening, or
yeah. I will do a bit of trying to describe the graphs as well, which is a bit of a weird one. This first one here, we're talking about net additional dwellings. So basically, really, how many additional homes have been built, yeah?
Yeah, and if you look at those stats, you'll see that sometimes it's been as low as like 120,000 was built after the difficulties of the banking crash. The whole house building period was at almost its worst. But what we've got on the graph is we've got significant population increase going on, and obviously there's some focus about who is coming into the country, and a lot of it wasn't about that. We have had significant population growth which has outstretched house building, and this graph particularly looks at the last 25 years, and at no year have we got to 300,000. And if you look at the period when we got close, which was from 2016 through to about the start of lockdown, and actually the construction sector did a wonderful job during lockdown, we've got some other factors in play. We had quite a lot of office to residential conversions, and basically everything in the kitchen sink was being counted, and some of it wasn't of adequate quality, I'd argue. I was a Labour councillor. I believe in what they want to do, both on homelessness and on housing, but was it really wise to promise that we'd try and build 1.5 million homes in 5 years? So we haven't been building enough homes for years and years, particularly since the mid-70s. So that is 50 years ago. And because we haven't been building enough, that then has all sorts of follow-on impacts in terms of the price of homes, the positioning of the big house builders, the damage to a lot of the smaller house building firms. It means that rents have soared, housing prices have soared, all sorts of consequences. But for me, and we'll come back to it later, the people who suffer the most, Paul, are at the bottom, on the bottom rung of the ladder. Some of them have drowned. They're forced to go into temporary accommodation. They can't afford the rents in London or a whole load of other places. Governments have failed. The councils have ducked out. The private sector has done its bit, but it hasn't been given the levers and the incentives to build more.
I tell you what, we're going. Now you haven't got this graph, but what I'm gonna slip in the graph I bang on about a lot, which is the number of SME developers compared to the number of homes built, which shows the peak of SME developers, smaller house builders, was 1988. As planning got way more complex, the number of those has dwindled, and it continues to dwindle. And I personally think that one of the really important things that needs to happen is we need many more good, smaller house builders to help solve the crisis,
On smaller developers, I mean, I live in a part of Cambridge that was built within 30 years. It's a nice part of Cambridge. You've got 4 or 10 different types of houses that create something that's a real quality community. And back in Victorian times and even in the 40s through to the 60s, you had a much more flexibility, access to smaller sites where the small developers can take on 15 homes a year, 25 homes a year. Over 10 years, in the right way, they could roll out a community of 300 homes. And that hasn't happened in the last 20 years.
And not only that, it tended, they were more like bespoke individual designs, a lot more character, typically because they weren't trying to, fit in standard house types. And I'm not particularly having a go at that or those, but when you have got lots of good little developers doing lots of good little stuff, it all builds up to create nice character, I think.
Yeah. You look in parts of London, you look in any cities, including into the 50s. Obviously, the house types change, different, more light into houses, larger footprints. But you have everything on the street. You don't have big car parking lots. You have legibility, permeability. You've just got a place that people can identify as their home when they drive home or get on a bus home.
I know for a fact, lots of fantastic stuff has been done around Cambridge the last few years.
Yeah, you were talking to David Birkbeck.
Yeah, exactly.
We definitely need some of those bigger developments. And what also has failed, particularly in the last 30 years, has been to work with the people who can deliver those big strategic sites so that you've got planning, say, across Cambridgeshire or across Essex or across the southwest, where you say, we're going to go hammer and tongs for those 30 major developments, new versions of Milton Keynes or Peterborough or different cities like we're in Peterborough today. There's got to be delivery on the big scale, but like you said, the smaller builders built well. They built local. You've got a bit of vernacular, a bit of difference. So you wake up and you know which city or town you're in, not like you look out the window and it could be anywhere.
Exactly. So we need all of it, don't we?
Where I think what's missing at the moment is we're going to build 300,000 homes a year. Well, where's the beef? Where's the strategy? What are the different levers? And yes, free up the planning system, but that the whole sector is much more complicated. No reference by government to downs and ups in the market. No thought about exactly what is the combination. So I can't support claiming we're going to build 300,000 unless I can see where the numbers come from.
Yeah, no, I agree. And look, and I'm no massive fan of this government, but I've got to say, fair play to them in terms of the changes they've made to planning, and they've made it quick. Credit where credit's due. Yeah. But there is a lot more, obviously, that still needs solving.
I'm not a full-time economist, but I know that there's a whole range of factors. They've got 20 other dials that they haven't tried to use yet.
Anyway, net additional dwellings last 25 years, there hasn't been enough.
There hasn't, and the population has jumped. So the next slide looks back to 2 periods. I mentioned after the war, Honorin Bevan didn't just invent the health service or soldier to make it happen. Lots of other people put the ideas together. He was housing minister as well. So you can just imagine the effort that was needed. And we're an anniversary year. It's 80 years since the troops came back, the ones that survived the war. And unlike after the First War, they genuinely did come back to new homes. So I've got an image in mind, a guy called Hector Murdoch bouncing down pathway into a new prefab home in Tulse Hill that was built only 2 months after the war ended with Japan. He'd been a prisoner of the Japanese and suffered, but there was over 10 years, 156,000 factory-built panels onto lorries, building prefabs. Not saying it's the only part of the answer, but what you had from all the way from 1946 to 1976, with a little bit of a tail end which died, you had successive governments, the prime ministers, the whole governments were committed, particularly with councils, identifying small, big sites, building literally several million council homes in that time, at the same time as understanding that the private sector had to be freed to build. You didn't have that kind of NIMBYism, the kind of parochial view, we don't want any more houses near us. We don't want council houses in particular because we don't know what sort of people live in those. So up until 1976, we were building more and more what are called social rent or affordable rent homes, as well as a really healthy private sector, as well as home prices didn't kind of zoom up. I'm part of a lucky generation at 70. We've banked a load of money out of the housing market. Many 70-year-olds are living in a 3 or 4 bed home with a couple. We've now got a completely different environment for the people who are trying to get on the housing ladder now. So for me, that graph just shows that failure really of governments. And it happened when in the 70s, the Labour government was fighting, not unlike today, a really difficult economic environment when, in a way, the good times ended in 1976 for the building of social homes. And then you would have all of those builders had a lot more certainty, Paul, because if there was a downturn, if the housing market for buying new homes was down, it stabilised the production of homes and the choice of sites. So people can look around cities across the country and towns and villages, even rural areas, and you can identify the council homes. There's nothing wrong with them. They're very good homes. They're still there. They look as good as they looked 50 years ago. In 1976, basically the tap was turned off on affordable rent housing.
What exactly happened?
I think one of the happy positions was for that government and for Mrs. Thatcher when she took over in 1979 was it looked like housing had been solved. So I think one of the things, every government tries to put off spending money until the next government, not in my term of office. If infrastructure investment is appalling because everybody's so short term. Yeah. But yeah, there was the IMF had rolled in. There's not many people as old as me listening to this, but the position in the 70s was that the government couldn't balance the books without borrowing. And to some extent, the country had lived off the hog for quite a couple of decades. And you'd started with Macmillan with the phrase, people have never had it so good. And we had this really happy period. People were getting better health service, better schools. When I went to university, that was at a time, really, the first time when people from working class backgrounds from a broader range of society and women were actually able to go to university in the 60s and 70s. So you look back, and people do look back as if, oh, it was such a lovely time. But it really genuinely was a time when every 10 years people were better off than the previous 10 years. So I think some of the withdrawal meant that housing suddenly moved from being one of the top 3 priorities to not being there. Then the economy kind of recovered, but if you look at the graph later on, and we've got it all the way up to coming on for sort of 2020, there's virtually no social housing, no council housing. A lot of councils have given away their housing. Peterborough, we're sitting in Peterborough. All of the council housing from the city council was effectively gifted to a local housing association, and they're not the same beast. They're not focusing on homelessness. They want a decent quality of tenant. So there's a disconnect between councils who genuinely were in the front line. And I remember I was a councillor in London in 1980, and I could ring up people and work out a place where I could get an allocation of a home to people. There still was quite a lot of council homes, and inevitably as a councillor you want to be popular, and so it was a feature then that we were able to find homes for people. The tail end of that, if you look at the graph into 1980, was that there were still more council homes. And sadly, from 1980, things don't look so good. On this graph, which is Shelter put this together, what had happened in terms of council and low affordable rent homes, the idea that people who couldn't buy had somewhere to live, you can see a sharp change. And so at 1980, instead of there being more homes available, you've got a net fall. I wouldn't have objected to right to buy if 100% of the money had been used to build a home, but it wasn't. And so effectively, in addition to not building enough homes for everybody in the last 45 years since 1980, it's actually gone back. We've gone backwards. I listened to a Tory Lord speak who used to be a Wandsworth councillor a couple of months ago saying, well, we had exactly the same number of homes, Paul. So if it is true that there were still those homes, and people who had paid rent for years earned the privilege of owning it. A lot of them were bought by their children, gave them the money.
So you know what? It's funny enough, actually, just on yesterday, there was someone posted about this on LinkedIn, and do you think it was a good thing, the whole right to buy thing? And I responded and told exactly that story. Me and my sister, when we left home and started earning a few
I didn't know this, Paul.
Yeah, no, straight up. Me and my sister, when we left home and started earning a few quid, and my mum and dad retired, we bought our council house.
Yeah.
Interestingly, and then obviously when they died, we kept it. We rented it out to the council
for more money.
Well, just market rate, whatever that was at the time, you know.
So I can totally understand, and I can see the politics of it. That effectively, Mrs. Thatcher did liberate people. People who'd thought, "No, I'm never going to own a home," had that opportunity, and you can see from the graph that there's been splurges of sales around. So there was a lot of sales early on when she announced it and it got moving, and then a big sales, then a slowdown, and then in the 2000s, in the noughties, then there was a lot of sales, and then there's been another sequence of sales as the discounts increased when Cameron did that in 2010. Yes, those homes still existed, but what it's meant is that a lot of people had to depend on the private rent sector to try and fight for somewhere to live. And in cities where there's big pressure of population, of wealth, like London, that was really bad news for a lot of people on lower incomes. So for the house building sector, not having that continuous replacement of those homes also missed a major opportunity. So we've got a big population growth through all of the last 40 years, and we just haven't got enough homes, particularly for people at the bottom rung of the ladder.
100%. So let's have a look at this next one.
So what that flows into is just looking at exactly who owns homes and how they're being funded. So people who pay rent, particularly like council tenants, over 30 years, you can just about pay off the cost if it was built in a low build cost decade. So if you go, this goes back a bit further before you or I were even imagined. And after the First War, and it didn't really change until the Second War, most people, particularly people on lower incomes, had to rent. And rent isn't bad. In Germany, it works really well. In some countries where housing costs have stayed moderate, that means that rent is really affordable. So, yeah, my partner's son rents a flat in Berlin. It's a good deal. So private rent by itself...
But they've got rent controls, haven't they, I think?
That is true. That is true. So you've had all the debate in the last few years about is it Section 21 or anyway, just the ability of landlords to say, you know what, I'm going to move you out. I've got other plans. Yep. And often the other plan is to put it back on the market at 30 or 50% more rent. If we go back 100 years, we've got the private rental sector. 100 years ago, we had under 30% of people households owned their own place. And even though there was a lot of social housing being built after the war, what you can see from the graph is if you just roll on from, say, the Second World War through to about 1990, you've actually got a doubling of the number of people who owned their own place. So in theory, we could have had that even continuing up to about 80%. It's not impossible, but as you know, and as I know from a variety of housing transactions during my 50 years as an adult, that the house prices have, I mean, in my city in Cambridge, I bought a house for 150,000 in 1994, and that house is now worth 1.5 million. So it's 10 times as much as the price that was paid for it. Thankfully, that doesn't cover the whole country, that level of increase, but it just means that people are actually priced out of buying their own home. And if you look at it, there's actually been a dip from about just sort of 1995 to where we are now. And the big increase again has been in private rental. It's not as big as it was 100 years ago, but you've seen a fall due to the sale of council homes in the social rent, and you've seen the growth of private rent, including 1 in 4 council homes that were sold over the 1980 to 2020 are now private rental homes, and they're not at the same rent; they're at a higher rent. So you've got a much more awkward fight. If you just look at what I see in the graph over the last 20 years, I see basically a war going on where people who want to buy have had major problems. People who want to rent can't find it. There are very good landlords. A lot of people end up renting from people for 30 years. But housing is a bit of a tragedy. And it is now swallowing a far higher percentage of a lot of people's incomes, particularly hard-working, lower-income families.
100%, I agree. And it's interesting. So this graph we're looking at here goes up to 2022. And it'd be interesting, I'm sure somewhere out there, there'll probably be a more up-to-date one, can absolutely guarantee that this gap will be getting wider in terms of the number of owner-occupied homes will be continuing to go down, and the number of private rented ones will continue to increase.
So I looked at the 2011, Paul, at the 2011 census data for Cambridge. I looked at 2001. So in 2001, if I recall rightly, I had 15% of people in Cambridge were in private rental, and that went up to sort of more like 22% in 2011. In 2021, it's up to 30%. So if you took, and I regard Cambridge as a lucky city. I call it a city of considerable magic. There's a lot of things going on, and you've got quite a number of people who were lucky enough to be in sort of good manual labour jobs in the 1950s and 60s, and they're very comfortable now. But you've got a complete gap between the people who own their homes and people who are having to compete really tough on the level of rents in a city that's growing quickly.
And just tell me what you think about that, because I know there are people out there that say, oh, everything's changed. Young people don't want to own their own home anymore. They like to be able to be more mobile and move around and blah blah blah. Well, I don't know how true that is, or more if it's a case of not that they don't want to, it's just that they've given up because it's so hard. And they can't. It's just almost impossible to own your own home. Do people really just want to rent? What do you think?
So, yeah, my son has got a shared equity house, and he's paying half of it in rent, and it's worked out really well for him. I just think that there's just not enough housing out there. I look at a picture of people at different levels, rungs on the ladder. Your ability to move from, say, Coventry to Bristol and back to Manchester is going to be much easier if you'd got a foot on the housing ladder. And the meaning of that phrase in money terms is that you've bought your first home, or you've got a massive mortgage. Say in the 1990s, somebody managed to get their equity together, got a deposit, and they took out a mortgage. They've been protected, or at least so. People who own it all, they're in boomland. They've pocketed a lot of upswing. People who at different years, and I'd say the same now, I'd still say to people who can afford to do it, that my experience, your experience, lots of people listening, one of the things that they most remember with satisfaction is when they moved into a bit of owning a bit of a home. It gives you so much more freedom. If you say moving from Coventry to Bristol and you've got a rent, and then later on you've got to move to Manchester, I wouldn't like to be that person. It's just tough. You don't know what you're going to get. The supply has just been so poor.
Okay, so let's have a look at the next one.
If you look at the boom areas, Oxford, Cambridge, Milton Keynes even, and Peterborough's grown quickly, and you look at the income it takes to buy a home, then the affordability. So if you look at the income that it takes to buy a home, this graph basically shows how many years it's going to take of income. It's a comparison of how much people earn, Paul, to the price of the home that they get. So average family incomes might now be, say, average family incomes of 50,000. I'm not saying they are, but quite a lot of people with two incomes are getting 50 or 60,000 pounds. This graph basically says, well, you multiply that by a factor of 10, if for no particular purpose, but just really for the point of saying how affordable it is. Say we take the example of 50,000, and we say we take 2010. Then it would you were earning enough over 10 years to pay for a £300,000 home, mainly on a mortgage. But the point is, going back, what we're talking, just about 30 years ago to the mid-90s, homes were costing 3 times that annual family income.
Yep.
Trying to put it simply, by 2023, well, it was at its worst before lockdown, and the construction sector actually did an amazing job during lockdown, because it was actually building at a good rate. We got a bit more affordability back. I don't believe people who say it doesn't matter how many homes we build, it's always going to be expensive. It's about shortage. So we've changed from it taking 3.5 years family income equivalent to the price of a home back 25, 30 years. 30 years ago, it was 3.5 years. And at the peak in 2021, it was 9 years. So as a multiple also of house prices during that period, what we've just seen is just like housing is just expensive.
You know, over the last 30 odd years, housing has just got increasingly unaffordable.
To buy, to rent, it damages the economy because it means, Paul, that it's really tough to move about. I don't think people want to move. They want to live in a community, or they have children. They create a real nest, and they want to stay roughly where they are. We want to look after our children. So you've then got the factor, Paul, that some people are able to pass on flexible income. I'd say anybody who's getting to my age should be thinking about keeping their capital flexible, because you don't know when your children are going to need it. The wealth that we've got, we're in a much stronger position to help our children than a lot of families. I'd say now, Paul, it's that much harder to get onto the housing ladder for anybody who's under the age of 40 than it was. I mean, it wasn't that difficult going back to the 70s when I first got a share of a home.
And nowadays, well, I wouldn't say it's difficult. I mean, it's almost impossible for lots of people. Certainly, if you haven't got parents that have got a few quid and are going to help you out of a deposit, you know.
So that is a block based on net wealth. So yeah, you've got the issue of couples of 60 years and older who've got 2 or 4 spare bedrooms. but you've also got that inequality, the ability for people to help their children, and the skewing of the house prices because we haven't built enough means that you've got a lot of potential buyers that even at the best prices of the volume house builders, they can't get there. And we've seen what's happened in the twos and fros, the swaying of interest rates. We really need to have an economy that's going to get us back to 3 or 4% interest rates so that people can borrow 70% of the equity to buy a home. So it ain't good at the moment, and it's blocking some of the ambitions of the bigger house builders to build the volumes that the government says that they want built.
So I'll tell you a few other things, just on the sort of general wider what's happening in the market perspective, because you know
that far better than me.
One of the things that I'm obviously trying to do is support and encourage more good housing, and in particular more good developers. The biggest growth areas in development are, for reasons we've sort of touched upon really, are build to rent, which I'll do a whole complete show on because it gets housing created of a certain sort, but I'm not mad on it actually.
Well, I'm interested in Rent Plus, but I know from people that I know, and I know from what I regard as the less than adequate performance of some housing associations on mixed products. I like Rent Plus. I like the opportunity for people to switch their equity over time and to be in a position to build up a share and hopefully be able to buy a future point. But there's a bunch of products out there which I just think have been missold to people. Stuff that's called anything that's cheaper than full price is called affordable. And there just needs to be more choice. But for me, the people who've really suffered are, say, a coach driver and a woman who's doing quite a really important job in a hospital or in a care home, working their socks off. And in a lot of the country, they're having to pay 40 or 50% out of their income just to get housing.
What's happening at the same time is people are getting squeezed into smaller and smaller spaces, which is why there's been such a boom in HMOs over the last 20 odd years. And also now such a boom in the development sector in co-living, which is basically really... people that do it won't like me saying it, giant HMOs. Now you can make them all sexy and funky and all the rest of it. And bottom line is really people are just getting squeezed into smaller space because stuff's so unaffordable.
They are, but I wasn't around 100 years ago. But reading the books I've read and the accounts of people did. Two families used to share a home. People used to be more in the trade of trying to find somebody who they could share a rental for maybe 20 years. So I think I'm not against co-living and about looking at how you could design homes. It's possible to make homes more efficient. Say, if you did share a bathroom, or you might have a communal kitchen, which might have really plush gear. It's not suddenly going to change. Most people want to have their own spaces, but I think the private rented sector is well organised, and I have no problem with PRS and of new developments in a bunch of locations. As we've talked about, I'm a believer in diversity, which would include modern methods of construction. And I look at some of the flats that have gone up in London. I look at some of the people that are in the market of providing what are modest-sized places for people in their 20s and 30s. And if that does the business, it gives them their own front door. I think there is a trade-off, particularly in the expensive parts of Britain. I know from my own son that they've got a nice house, but they make use of the space in a way that I've never had to worry about. And so some of us have got space like cupboards and lots of bits of spare space, but it is possible to live even better if you organise yourself and you get a really cleverly designed small space. So I am in favour of sort of pocket living type homes in certain environments because they do fit the bill. They give everything that people want, provided that they've got cafes, social facilities, gym, a whole range of other stuff within the neighbourhood. So in Cambridge, there's a lot of intensive building, and I'm not against some of that being fairly compact homes.
So let's have a look at this final little
Yeah, well,
one.
this is just, I don't know when it's going to go out, Paul, but we've just gone through one of the most astonishing periods of time with Trump and his tariffs. What really shook him up was the fact that American bond market started to go a bit pear-shaped, and we suffered that in Britain with the mistakes of trying to batter in a new form of economy which didn't work, and the fright of the markets can last quite a long time. So just looking at interest rates, we were pretty fortunate for a long period of time. I mean, food didn't go up in price much for 10 years between 2015 and the sort of beginning of lockdown. And interest rates, if you look at that graph, were stuck low.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is an interesting one. So if you're not watching online, so this is a graph. So this one goes from January 18 to July 23. A lot of that time, interest rates were fairly low and fairly flat. Mortgage rates.
Yep.
And which is, fairly unprecedented, really. You all know, being older.
Oh,
that
gosh,
was crazy.
No,
and people just got used to that. If this went back another 30 odd years, that'd be...
It was up and down.
Up and down.
We had periods with Norman Lamont. We had periods of each of the governments.
15%.
I think one of the reasons we've got so grumpy as a country is, and it's easy for me because I haven't been a leader, but I just think economically we've been so badly led. Anyway, but if you do, as you say, look at that graph, if you actually look at the pinkish line, the new mortgages, because of the fact that if you just look at the fact that people could get mortgages, Paul, cheaper than the mortgages that other people had got before them. So the market in that little halcyon period up until and through lockdown was able to offer mortgages cheaper because of the fact that the belief was that the interest rates were going to change in 20 or 30 years' time. So if you remember Gordon Brown, he was a great one for saying that there'll be no more boom and bust. There was certainly certainty and, to use a phrase, cheap money. And what then happened, and it was probably going to happen a bit anyway, was, as you said, it was a golden period and it was going to come to an end. And it did come to a kind of crashing end, partly because of the Truss government, and suddenly the market didn't see it as rosy anymore. And we've had all sorts of uncertainties like the Ukraine war. We're an isolated economy. We haven't got any stability because we've got to fight our own corner. And then you've got just all sorts of actions that affected fuel and everything and interest rates. No one can predict interest rates, I don't think, for the next 10 years.
This goes up to July 23. And about a year before that is when mortgage rates really started shooting up quite quickly.
They did.
And
people are on 6 or 7% mortgages now.
Yeah.
And this is just, I don't know if this is all the information, but obviously some people could never get those kind of rates of 2 or 2.5% simply because they weren't owning as much of the home. Mortgages for some people were always costing more than 2 or 3%. But now, will mortgages come down? I'm reading today, Barclays think that the economy's going to be needing a boost. Money gets cheaper when there's a bit of sort of Keynesian sort of investment into the country. So we will see over the next few years. But as you know from being a key person in the Barrett team, the whole pattern of belief of whether people are going to borrow money and buy is also being read by the building sector to say, is this a year to start building more? And will Barrett's and Vistry and
well, it's interesting.
Persimmon shares start rising again?
That was the point I was going to make because, as a developer myself, trying to, sell stuff and struggling to sell it, and certainly selling it really slow. It's the same for all developers. I've got lots of mates of developers. I've trained lots of developers. Everyone is struggling to sell stuff.
Yeah.
So it's interesting jumping back to where we started talking about, improvements to planning. Since Labour government got in, they have made a lot of changes really quickly, all good stuff in terms of speeding things up. But the problem is, I saw some stats the other day about the numbers of planning applications are massively down.
Yeah.
The reason they're massively down is because nearly all developers are in the same boat. They've got stuff that they can't sell or sell in slow. So they've got all of their money
they've already got quite a lot of the sites
tied up in stuff.
Yeah.
So the last thing you're going to do is be spending 50, 100, 2, 3, 4, 500 grand on a planning application when you haven't got out of your last deal yet, and you can't actually even see for sure when are you going to get out of it. And before you start thinking about the next one, really.
Well, land is still too expensive, isn't it? So, going back to the smaller volume builders, if you just take an area like East England or West England, you've got a lot of what they would call rural exception sites. You've got sites that could just be brought forward for affordable rent. You could just say to the landowner, look, we're not going to give you planning permission for open market sale, but we do need 20 affordable rent homes in that village. Is going to cap your expectations on how much you're going to cash in for the land. I don't know the detail, but I'm sure some of the big volume builders have paid more than enough for the land, and that has put quite a albatross around the chances of them getting into a profitable scheme. Don't they have to wait till the market actually starts turning up for people to pay a bit of a premium on what is the base cost for the home? A lot of this stuff with land values and developers doesn't work the way people think it does, and that's one of the reasons again I wanted to do this. Yeah, well, you've got some other programs you're going to have to advertise. Well, we are. Well, let's just talk like land banking, for example, right? It isn't really a thing. Yeah, I don't know what you think. I personally don't think changes to the planning system make much odds. I think it does make a bit, and we've had this parochial NIMBYism where councils have been part of it, and we haven't had enough land allocated. I personally think if you want 50,000 homes in your area in, say, the next 10 years, then you've got to actually put in 70,000 because 20,000 will never come forward. So I think one of the problems is this limit of saying we want 50,000 and they'll all happen on these 15 sites and a lot of Diddy sites, and then it doesn't happen. You know more than me, but I just worry that the economics that's built in, and then we've seen this huge inflation in construction costs. Yeah, absolutely. Makes it really difficult for a lot of people. There hasn't been any new government initiative which would actually help people to buy, just as what I would like to see them, and going back to the earlier graphs, I would just like to see the people who are homeless, the councils are spending 1.5 billion on temporary accommodation, 2.5 billion, sorry. Home Office is spending 1.5 billion on their responsibilities for people who need housing. That's 4 billion being spent on temporary accommodation. It's not so bad for travel lodges because they're used heavily, but how can a family with 2 children live in a room for 6 months in a travel lodge and you call that a place to live? So you've got problems both at the top of the market, and you've also got particular problems for those that are struggling because there isn't enough housing. We have failed this generation. There does need to be freeing up of all sorts of housing. And we're coming on to the last picture in this set, but and this scheme didn't actually get built in the end. Small reason was it was a car park, and in the end, the local community said we didn't want to lose it, the Glastonbury car park. Well, so Glastonbury is a real community as well as every summer attracting over 250,000 people. And this was just an example of particularly this scheme, because Glastonbury also attracts a lot of van dwellers. In the southwest, there are a lot of van dwellers in the southwest. I didn't know you knew that. I was just about to tell you. Yeah. This is one of the other things that people, I think, depending on sort of what world you live in, you possibly wouldn't know.
the amount of people living in vans, because again, stuff is so unaffordable, they're squeezed into smaller and smaller and smaller space. Loads of people living in vans. Glastonbury's a classic for it. There is whole swathes of areas with people living in vans and caravans. I didn't know that you knew that. Obviously you do. But
I know a bit about the Southwest, mate. Effectively, you've got different explosions of problems in different parts of the country. So you've got all of the second homers and the impact that has on the market in holiday areas. Yeah. You've got van dwellers there. Rough sleepers are only 2% of the homeless problem. They're the tip of the iceberg. So whichever community you're in, except maybe some places in the north where they do genuinely have more homes than are needed, not by much, you've got problems. So going back to the talk originally, that mention of sort of a guy, Hector Murdoch, coming back from the war, where he had managed to fight the Japanese and lived in prison for nearly 3 years, 3.5 years. Prefabs, 156,000 were built. Not the only solution, but that ability with modern methods, panels, ability to put up buildings. And it just happens that in the Southwest, like in Bristol, there's just a real flourishing focus on just seeing how we can build clever, smaller buildings.
So for people that have not seen previous episodes with my mate Dave Hughes, did you connect with my mate Dave Hughes?
Yeah, no, I'm really impressed. And as I've said to him, I think we were like twins. That I think there's some really good architects, as well as other people right across the building sector, who recognise the scale of what needs to happen. So I'm with Dave on architects looking at producing more efficient and different versions of buildings, a bit like your co-housing point. The homeless problem isn't going to be solved if we don't also look at transitional housing. So there's these threads of the fact that particularly in the high housing cost areas, we need compact homes. Some of them will only be transitional, but I can't see us sorting out, I'm sorry to say, in my lifetime, I don't see this homeless problem going away, which is a tragedy. We've got 25 years of home building at the cheaper end and probably 40 years at the more costly owner-occupied end. I mean, effectively, this wraps us back, Paul, to the fact that we went off message in the mid-1970s, and we've seen a failure of successive governments. 50 years of governments have failed to create the right environment. I haven't got it in for the house builders, the big ones, because they're responding to an environment. And yeah, people can't rent for a price they can afford. People can't buy. And therefore, there isn't the incentive for people to invest in more housing. We are not short of land. We've got plenty of land. Land has to be more available. We have to plan for more land than the number of homes we need to build every 5 years. And that way we will actually meet the targets a bit better. I'd like to achieve 300,000 homes a year. It can be done. It ain't happening at the moment.
It's not, but let's keep talking and we'll find a way to get closer, hopefully.
Yeah, well, I think what we need is a strategy that actually pulls the various threads together, understands housing economics, and can provide housing for people on each level of income. Plus, get people out of temporary accommodation and travel lodges and give them somewhere decent to live.
Okie dokie. Well, I know we're going to talk more about that on another episode of this. For people that haven't seen the couple of chats I had with my mate Dave Hughes about temporary housing,
and it's good,
and some solutions for that, they should go and check that out and watch the next one of these that I'm going to be doing with you shortly.
Okay, thanks for bringing me in, and I think it does for me point to the fact that you've got to dig into the data and we've got to build more homes.
Thanks for tuning in to Inside Property Development. Please remember to like and subscribe. Do join us every week where we'll be speaking to house builders, developers, experts, planners, and everyone involved in trying to get more much needed housing created the right way. We'll learn together how we can collaborate rather than fight, and by working together, we can all help create better places, spaces and homes and a much more beautiful world.